In every election, politicians promise to fight for the working class. But here's the truth, they often forget about those same people as soon as the votes are counted. Did you know that over 40% of Americans say they feel abandoned by politicians once the election is over? Despite making up a huge part of the voting population, the working class gets little attention until campaign season rolls around. In fact, studies show that working class voters are ignored in favor of wealthier donors who hold the real power. You might think politicians are focused on issues that affect the everyday worker, but instead, they cater to big businesses and special interests. While the working class struggles with stagnant wages, rising healthcare costs, and job insecurity, many politicians continue to line their pockets with corporate donations. In this video, we're going to uncover why politicians ignore the working class until election time, and the dirty tricks they use to win votes. We'll dive into how they manipulate promises, avoid welfare policies, and how their connections with big business leave the working class behind. Stay tuned to find out how this cycle has been hurting everyday people for decades, and whether it's finally time for a change. Chapter 1: The Silent Majority, Forgotten Voices or Willing Ignorance. The working class is often called the silent majority. But, is this silence the result of being ignored, or is it a willing choice? For years, politicians have promised to represent the people who work hard every day, yet often fall short. Why does this happen? One reason could be the constant focus on winning votes from the wealthy, the ones who donate to campaigns. In fact, studies show that candidates who raise more money tend to win. The wealthy are often the ones with the most influence, which leaves the working class behind. Politicians are quick to use working class voters as a talking point during speeches but slow to deliver meaningful policies. A 2019 study from the American Political Science Review found that low-income voters are often ignored by politicians in favor of more affluent voters. Why? Because those in higher income brackets tend to have more political power. So, while it might seem like politicians care about the working class, the reality is that their priorities are shaped by money and power. One key reason for this neglect is that politicians often don't face direct consequences for ignoring the working class. Research shows that low-income voters have lower voter turnout, which means they have less influence on election outcomes. This leaves many politicians thinking that they don't need to cater to the working class until election time, when the narrative suddenly changes. Chapter 2: Election Time Hustle. Politicians' sudden love affair with the working class. Suddenly, every politician loves the working class, right before elections. This shift can feel like a game of make-believe. It's during campaign season when politicians begin to visit factories, talk about jobs, and offer promises they haven't kept in years. Why? Because campaigns are all about winning votes. The working class is a large voting bloc, and ignoring them in an election year is risky. One of the most interesting tactics used during elections is the Hail Mary move, when a politician spends months, or even years, ignoring the needs of the working class, only to rush to their defense with promises of new policies. Studies show that this sudden attention often works. In fact, 60% of low-income voters reported feeling more hopeful after hearing election year promises, despite knowing that most of these promises are rarely kept. This highlights the power of temporary attention, which is often enough to sway a few undecided voters. Take the 2016 US presidential election, for example. Both candidates suddenly made working-class issues central to their campaigns, even though they had spent most of their careers focusing on other priorities. Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," was designed to resonate with the working class, tapping into their frustration. Likewise, Hillary Clinton promised to create jobs, a goal she seemed to forget about in her earlier campaigns. The impact of these last-minute shifts shows how politicians understand the importance of working-class votes but are only willing to court them when the election clock is ticking. Chapter 3: Promises and Polls. How campaigns manipulate the working-class vote. Campaigns are experts in manipulation, especially when it comes to working-class voters. Political strategists know that promises and polls can be powerful tools to sway public opinion. One of the most common techniques is polling data, which politicians use to shape their messaging. A study from the Journal of Politics found that 72% of political campaigns use polling data to target low-income voters with specific promises during election seasons. The strategy is simple: show the working class what they want to hear. In 2020, a study by Pew Research found that 65% of working-class voters felt politicians never follow through on their promises, yet they still believed these promises. This shows that while many voters are skeptical, the power of a well-crafted message still has a huge impact. Politicians know that focusing on issues like job creation, tax cuts, and healthcare, things that directly affect the working class, can generate strong support. Polling also helps politicians fine-tune their messages to specific regions. For example, a politician running in a factory-heavy district might promise better working conditions, while another running in a farming community might talk about better agricultural subsidies. This personalization is designed to convince the working class that the candidate understands their specific struggles. The key to this strategy is repetition. Politicians spend months running ads with slogans like "Jobs for all" or "Raising wages," even though those promises rarely materialize. But voters remember the promises because they're repeated over and over, both in ads and speeches. It's a tactic designed to keep the working class engaged long enough to get him to the polls. These strategies are not new. In fact, they're nearly as old as politics itself. Every election season, the cycle repeats. Politicians gear up with promises and policies that cater to working-class voters, only to forget about them once the election is over. And despite all of this, politicians continue to win. Why? Because, as a 2020 Harvard study pointed out, voter apathy among the working class plays a significant role. Many feel that their vote doesn't matter, which only reinforces the cycle of neglect. This chapter highlights a crucial point: the manipulation of working-class voters isn't just about empty promises, it's about creating a sense of hope, even if that hope never materializes. It's about giving just enough to keep them on the hook, waiting for the next election to roll around. If you're enjoying the content so far, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on our next deep dive into how politics really work. Chapter 4: The Irony of Welfare. When helping the poor is politically unfashionable, there's an interesting irony when it comes to welfare and the working class. Politicians often avoid talking about welfare policies, despite the fact that millions of working-class people rely on them. Why? Because welfare programs are often seen as unfashionable in the political world. Politicians worry about being labeled as soft on the poor, which could hurt their image with wealthier voters. A study by the Brookings Institution found that 70% of Americans believe welfare should focus on creating jobs, not just providing direct aid. But the reality is that politicians often back away from expanding welfare programs, even when it's clear the working class needs them. This avoidance only worsens when they know their wealthier supporters might view welfare as a burden on taxes. In the US, for example, the debate around expanding Medicaid was a huge issue during the 2016 elections. Many states rejected Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, even though studies showed it could significantly help the working class. A 2018 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that Medicaid expansion reduced financial stress for families by nearly 20%. Still, politicians shied away from endorsing it, mainly because of concerns over how it might affect their wealthier donors. Politicians often forget that welfare isn't just for the unemployed, it also helps the working class. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, 40% of the people using food stamps are employed, but their jobs don't pay enough to meet their basic needs. Yet, we rarely hear politicians passionately defending these programs. The irony is clear: welfare policies that could directly help working-class families often take a backseat to issues that appeal to wealthier constituents. Chapter 5: The Corporate Connection. Why big business and the working class don't mix. Big businesses and the working class don't often see eye to eye, and that's because politicians are often caught between the two. Corporate donors have immense power in shaping policies, and they know how to use it. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, nearly 70% of campaign contributions come from corporate interests. These contributions shape political priorities, often to the detriment of working-class needs. In 2020, Amazon and other tech giants spent millions on lobbying efforts to influence policies that would benefit their businesses. For example, Amazon has successfully lobbied against increases in the federal minimum wage, arguing that such a move would hurt their bottom line. But the people who are impacted by these decisions, the working class, often aren't in a position to challenge them. It's not just large corporations, either. Politicians also rely on financial backers from industries like energy, banking, and healthcare. In 2018, energy companies spent over $140 million on lobbying. This kind of influence often leads to policies that favor corporate profits, while the working class bears the brunt of the consequences. Whether it's through lower wages, job insecurity, or even environmental degradation, the working class often ends up paying the price. The issue isn't just about corporate influence, but the way it distorts policy. Research from Harvard Business Review shows that when politicians prioritize the interests of big businesses over those of the working class, they're not just helping corporations, they're hurting long-term economic growth. Policies that neglect the needs of workers can undermine productivity and create a cycle of wage stagnation, which ultimately impacts the entire economy. Politicians know the reality: corporate money is hard to ignore. So, while they may make public statements about helping the working class, their actual policies often reflect the interests of their corporate donors. This creates a disconnect where working-class voters are expected to trust politicians who consistently serve corporate interests over their own. Chapter 6: The Working Class Awakening. Will they keep falling for the same tricks? The final question remains: will the working class continue to fall for the same tricks, or will they start demanding real change? The working class is waking up, and a shift in political engagement is starting to take shape. Research shows that younger voters, particularly those from lower-income backgrounds, are more likely to challenge the status quo. According to a 2020 Pew Research study, 55% of people under 30 think the political system is rigged to favor the wealthy. This new generation is questioning the promises made during election seasons and is more skeptical of politicians who rely on empty rhetoric. They're demanding transparency and action, not just words. But this awakening comes with challenges. Many working-class voters are still stuck in a cycle of low voter turnout, as they feel their votes won't make a difference. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, only 46% of eligible voters with household incomes under $30,000 voted in the 2020 presidential election. This gap in voter participation continues to give politicians the leeway to ignore working-class needs. However, this trend is beginning to change. The rise of grassroots movements and labor unions is pushing the working class to the forefront of political conversations. For example, the $15 minimum wage movement has gained significant traction, with more than 25 U.S. states increasing their minimum wage in recent years. This movement is proof that the working class is starting to organize, demand, and push for the changes they deserve. The question remains: will this new wave of political awareness be enough to hold politicians accountable? Will they finally stop using the working class as a political tool? Only time will tell, but the growing awareness of political manipulation is a step toward real change. Working-class voters are no longer willing to be quiet, and it's possible that, in the future, they won't be so easily ignored by the politicians they elect. If you've made it this far, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more insights into how politics works and what we can do to make a difference. The fight for the working class has only just begun.